All right, so in the last two chapters that we read, we found out that Despero had overslept and the princess was now going straight to the dungeon with Midge. And we know that the princess doesn't really blame Midge. She actually feels bad for her. We learn the word empathy. And empathy is knowing how to feel what another person is feeling and kind of feeling bad for them or feeling happy for them. In this case, they're feeling bad for them. So we also know that Despero's plan now is to get a hold of the king and try and have the king help him to save the princess because he knows he's too small to do it on his own. Chapter 40 Forgiveness. He went first to the throne room, but the king was not there, and so Despero slipped through a hole in the molding and was making his way to the princess's room when he came upon the mouse council, 13 mice and one most very honored head mouse, sitting around their piece of wood debating important mouse matters. Despero stopped and stood very still. "Fellow honored mice," said the very most honored head mouse, and then he looked up from his makeshift table and saw Despero. "Despero?" he whispered. The other mice of the council leaned forward, straining to make some sense of the word that the head mouse had just uttered. "Pardon?" one said. "Excuse me?" said another. "I didn't hear right," said a third. "I thought you said Despero." The head mouse gathered himself. He tried speaking again. "Fellow members," he said, "a ghost. A ghost!" And then he raised a shaking paw and pointed at Despero. The other mice turned and looked. And there was Despero Tilling, covered in flour, looking back at them, the telltale red thread around his neck, a thin trail of blood. "Despero," said Lester. "Son, you've come back." Despero looked at his father and saw an old mouse whose fur was shot through with gray. How could that be? Despero had only been gone for a few days, but his father seemed to have aged many years in his absence. "Son, ghost of my son," said Lester, his whiskers trembling. "I dreamed about you every night. I dream about beating the drum that sent you to your death. I was wrong. What I did was wrong." "No," called the most very honored head mouse. "No. I've destroyed it," said Lester. "I've destroyed the drum. Will you forgive me?" He clasped his paws together and looked at his son. "No!" shouted the head mouse again. "No, do not ask a ghost to forgive you, Lester. You did as you should. You did what was best for the mouse community." Lester ignored the head mouse. "Son," he said, "please." Despero looked at his father, at his gray streaked fur and trembling whiskers, and at his front paws clasped together in front of his heart. He suddenly felt as if his own heart would break in two. His father looked so small and so sad. "Forgive me," said Lester again. Forgiveness, reader, is, I think, something very much like hope and love. A powerful, wonderful thing, and a ridiculous thing, too. Isn't it ridiculous, after all, to think that a son could forgive his father for beating the drum that sent him to his death? Isn't it ridiculous to think that a mouse could ever forgive anyone for such a thing? But still, here are the words Despero Tilling spoke to his father. He said, "I forgive you, Pa." And he said those words because he sensed it was the only way to save his own heart, to stop it from breaking in two. Despero, reader, spoke those words to save himself. And then he turned from his father and spoke to the whole mouse council. "You were wrong," he said, "all of you. You asked me to renounce my sins. I ask you to renounce yours. You wronged me. Now repent." "Never," said the head mouse. Despero stood before the mouse council, and he realized that he was a different mouse than he had been the last time he had faced them. He had been to the dungeon and back out of it. He knew things that they would never know. And what they thought of him, he realized, did not matter at all. And so, without saying another word, Despero turned and left the room. After he was gone, the head mouse slapped his trembling paws on the table. "Mice of the council," he said, "we have been paid a visit by a ghost who has told us to repent. We will now take a vote. All in favor of saying the visit did not occur, say aye." And from the members of the mouse council, there came a tiny but empathetic chorus of ayes. Only one mouse said nothing. That mouse was Despero's father, Lester Tilling, had turned his head away from the other members of the mouse council. He was trying to hide his tears. He was crying, reader, because he had been forgiven. Chapter 41 The Tears of a King. Despero found the king in P's bedroom, sitting on his daughter's bed, clutching the tapestry of her life to his chest. He was weeping, although weeping really is too small a word for the activity that the king had undertaken. Tears were cascading from his eyes. A small puddle had formed at his feet. I'm not exaggerating. The king, it seemed, was intent on crying himself a river. Readers, have you seen a king cry? When the powerful are made weak, they are revealed to be very human, to have hearts. Their diminishment is nothing short of terrifying. You can be sure that Despereaux was terrified, absolutely, but he spoke anyway. Sir? The mouse said to the king. But the king did not hear him, and Despereaux watched. King Philip dropped the tapestry and took his golden crown from his lap and used it to beat himself over the chest over and over. The king, as I have already mentioned, had several faults. He was nearsighted. He made ridiculous, unreasonable, difficult to enforce laws. And much in the way of Midgery Sow, he was not exactly the sharpest knife in the drawer. But there was one extraordinarily wonderful, admirable thing about the king. He was a man who was able and willing to love with his whole heart. And just as he had loved the queen with his whole heart, he too loved his daughter with the whole of it. Even more than the whole. He loved Princess P with every particle of his being, and she had been taken from him. But what Despereaux had come to say to the king had to be said, and so he tried again. Excuse me, he said. He wasn't certain, really, how a mouse should address a king. Sir didn't seem like a big enough word. Despereaux thought for a moment. He cleared his throat and spoke as loudly as he was capable of speaking. Excuse me, very most honored head person. King Philip stopped beating the crown against his chest. He looked around the room. Down here, very most honored head person, said Despereaux. The king's tears, still falling from his eyes, looked to the floor. The king, tears falling from his eyes, looked to the floor. He squinted. Is that Bug speaking to me? He asked. No, said Despereaux. I'm a mouse. We met before. A mouse, bellowed the king. A mouse is but one step removed from a rat. Sir, said Despereaux, very most honored head, sir. Please, you have to listen to me. This is important. I know where your daughter is. You do? Said the king. He sniffed, blew his nose on his royal cloak, and asked. Where? He said. And he bent over. He looked more closely at Despereaux. 1 tear, 2 tears, 3 enormous king-sized tears fell with audible plops onto Despereaux's head and rolled down his back, washing away the white of the flower and revealing his own brown fur. Sir, very most honorable head person, sir, said Despereaux as he wiped the king's tears out of his own eyes. She's in the dungeon. Liar, said the king. He sat back up. I knew it. All rodents are liars and thieves. There is none in the dungeon. My men have searched the dungeon. But no one really knows the dungeon except the rats, sir. There are thousands of places where she could be hidden, and only one rat would know. Your men would never be able to find her if the rats did not want her found. Ah, said the king. He clapped his hands over his ears. Don't speak to me of rats and what they know, he shouted. Rats are illegal. Rats are against the law. There are no rats in my kingdom. They don't exist. Sir, very most honorable head person, that is not the truth. Hundreds of rats live in the dungeon of the castle. One of them has taken your daughter, and if you will send... The king started humming. I can't hear you. Stop. He stopped to shout. I can't hear you. And anyway, what you are saying is wrong because you are a rodent, and therefore you are a liar. He started to hum again, and then he stopped and said, I have hired fortune-tellers and a magician. They are coming from distant lands. They will tell me where my beautiful daughter is. They speak the truth. A mouse cannot speak the truth. I'm telling you the truth, said Despereaux. I promise. But the king would not listen. He sat with his hands over his ears. He hummed loudly. Big, fat tears rolled down his face and fell to the floor. Despereaux sat and stared at him in dismay. What should he do now? He put a nervous paw to his neck and pulled at the red thread. And suddenly, his dream came flooding back to him. The dark and the light and the knight swinging his sword. And the terrible moment when he realized that the suit of armor was empty. And then, reader, he stood before the king, and a wonderful, amazing thought occurred to the mouse. What if the suit of armor had been empty for a reason? What if it had been empty because it was waiting for him? You know me. That was what the knight in his dream said. Yes, said Despereaux out loud in wonder. I do know you. I can't hear you, sang the king. I have to do it myself, said the mouse. I will be the knight in shining armor. There is no other way. It has to be me. Despereaux turned. He left the weeping king, and he went to find the threadmaster.